It could be the greatest decision you ever make, or it could ruin your life. Today, we're talking about franchises with franchise expert Liz Leonard on today's episode.
Today's episode is brought to you by Thrivecart. Need a shopping cart but don't want to pay monthly fees? Thrivecart is the perfect place to start your journey. When they first started, I didn't think they'd go the distance. Now I have an account. Yes, I've got egg on my face. See how easy Thrivecart makes it to sell digital products? Servemaster.com/Thrivecart.
Are you tired of dealing with your boss? Do you feel underpaid and underappreciated? If you want to make it online, fire your boss, and start living your retirement dreams now, then you come to the right place. Welcome to the Artificial Intelligence Podcast Show, where you will learn how to use artificial intelligence to open new revenue streams and make money while you sleep. Presented live from a tropical island in the South Pacific by best-selling author Jonathan Green. Now, here's your host. Now, I've always been fascinated with franchises because there's so many more than people realize. Like, a lot of people don't know, there's no UPS store that's not a franchise, for example. Like, every single UPS store is owned by somebody, not the company. And we often think, oh, the only franchises are fast food companies, and that's completely wrong. There's so many other types of franchises out there, and a lot of people don't really understand the world. So I'm always excited to talk to franchise people, because when my wife and I bought a hotel, boy, do I wish we had a manual, right? We had to do everything because the people before us, well, they cooked their books a lot. So every piece of information they had, everything about their numbers and operation and guest numbers was not true. And they had no policies in place for how to deal with a guest who was unruly, or how to deal with a guest who was early or late, or how to train their staff, or what is the process for cleaning a room so that it's kept to the maintained standard. And that's the beauty of a franchise, right? Is that it comes with an instruction manual, which my kids had come with one. So I'd love to know just all about your journey. Like, how did you first get interested in franchises, and how did that become the path that got you the most excited?
Yeah. And I love your reference. Turnkey systems is really kind of the analogy that I love to use with candidates. And just, when you're looking at whether it's an independent business or franchise, it doesn't matter whether it's business in general, you have to have your plan, your systems. It's called standard operating procedures, and, it's a lot of work. And I think, I'll respond to your question with, I've done an independent business with my husband in one of the toughest industries, which was childcare. We opened in a recession in 2007. We bought the real estate. It was a $1.2 million SBA loan. It was really scary, like really scary times. And we hired somebody to help us, which in my mind, looking back on it, was similar to franchising. We found a couple in the Silicon Valley that had done 14 schools, had obviously had the blueprint, and they agreed to consult for us. They gave us everything, vendor relationships, their handbooks, all the different pieces to the business. And, we paid $65,000 for that. And it's the best thing I ever could have done. And again, you look back at the past thinking, that endorsed my product, my service. It gave me confidence. I wasn't in it alone. And I think a lot of business owners are in it alone. And it's really scary to be alone, let alone opening in a recession. So we did build that business, Jonathan. We sold it. We were very successful, by the grace of God. And moms had to go back to work when the recession hit. So it was a very, very positive experience, but a lot of grit, a lot of grind, a lot of sleepless nights, like many business owners. So after we sold the business, we ended up buying a self-storage business. We actually just sold that last May. And upon selling these big investments, we decided to look into franchising. And neither my husband, Paul, or I wanted to do another startup. It was just too much work, way too much work. And we had little kids at the time. They were 4 and 7. So I went down the path just to see what was out there. Went on the internet back in the day, and this was 2014 when I started looking at franchising. And I didn't even know that franchise advising, coaching, consulting, that I could find an expert to help me. So we did end up buying a franchise. We own a kitchen tune-up franchise. My husband primarily operates it, but I wanted something for me, but I wanted 0 employees. I'm one of these unique people that doesn't like to manage people. And my only real experience managing people was at our school, where we had 22 women. And, I can joke about it all day long, but man, was that hard. It was the toughest thing I've ever done. but very rewarding. And that's how I discovered there were people out there to help me in this big ocean of franchises. Like, what would be right for Liz? Liz wants 0 employees. Can we even find her anything? So that's how I discovered it.
So let's talk about that because I'm very fascinated with this world because, again, there's so little information. And one of the dangers for someone who is thinking of going into franchise is there's almost spoiled for choice, right? You can go into franchising for cleaning gum off of sidewalks. You can go into franchising for cleaning cars. You can go into franchising for everything in between. And it's they show you the sunshine, right? They say it's growing. We've got 14 stores are all doing really good. And it's like, well, they're all in major cities. What if you don't live in New York or Los Angeles, right? Or like the numbers don't always translate because I grew up in Los Angeles and in Nashville. Guess what? People in Nashville and LA don't shop the same, right? Like there's different foot traffic. And I've seen a franchise, all it takes is the wrong location where nobody walks by. I once worked on a project with this music store, most beautiful music store you could ever imagine, the most talented people there, impossible to find, right? You have to go through a scary neighborhood to get there. I was like, guys, this is not good. And their website was beautiful, but Google couldn't scan it. I was like, you'll never appear in search results. No one will ever find you because the design is the wrong type of code. And it's like these small mistakes can make such a huge difference. So when you're looking at franchises and it sounds like you got some advice and stuff, what were the things that you were like, oh, I definitely don't want that, or this is a sign that like it's a risky franchise versus, oh, this is like the right direction. So like what are high risk versus low risk franchises, and like what's the right size to get in? Because sometimes you see these things, like I remember when I was a kid, Boston Market was everywhere. And then they all disappeared, right? They were all gone. And then there were Subways everywhere, and then Subway is shrinking. And like, it's not the company that's hurting, it's all those franchisees. And so that's really what I want to dive into is like, what are the things that like you tell people, watch out for this, because I love de-risking.
Yeah, it's kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of franchising in a nutshell. I think that, I work with several hundreds of franchisors, and are they all good? I can't answer that question, but, probably not. They're probably all not good. And I think you have to really spend your time doing due diligence to find the good ones. And there's a lot to that. So I can kind of segue into that next topic. So as kind of an advisor, like anybody, if you were to work with an attorney or a CPA or anybody helping you make a really big life decision that affects you from not just a monetary standpoint, but, it affects your quality of life, your family life, your sleep, everything. You want to make sure you really do your homework. And, they're a heavily regulated industry through the Federal Trade Commission, and there's a lot to know, which is overwhelming for a lot of people. So we want to make sure not to overwhelm people. But one of the best parts to investigating franchise brands, and there's several pieces to it, it takes 6 weeks to evaluate companies. We always have people compare and contrast. And I think that, any investment, whether it's college, cars, real estate, you're going to shop around. You're going to make a smart decision. You're going to ask a lot of questions, and you're going to interview franchisees, which is kind of, I call it the best part of franchise evaluation. So meeting people, asking them questions. You can ask them anything to do with the money side. On the franchisor side, they have to be very careful. They cannot give you an earnings claim. That's something that they will be very, very clear with. It's in the law. They can't do it. But interviewing franchisees, and I tell people, interview 7, interview 10, whatever you're comfortable with. But you want to make sure you ask the right questions from your training. Obviously, the total investment, did you, obviously get your loan at the highest level that you needed, making sure that you've got enough working capital. Are you prepared for your staffing model? Are you prepared for all the unknowns? I think there's a lot of unknowns in business. So I could kind of continue on that if you have any other questions, but due diligence is super critical in this process.
Yeah, one thing that I know, and obviously way more of a franchise than me, is that some people are good at building franchises and some people are really good at selling franchises.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell people that when you're making a decision, look at the risk as much more than the upside, right? Because yeah, like you said, look at multiple franchises, because maybe the first one, they're so convincing, they sound amazing, and you get so excited. Once you get emotionally invested in a deal, that's when like you're at the most vulnerable, right? That's when people go, that's that fear of loss, like, oh, some of the numbers are red flags. It's like early on in a relationship when all your friends are like, oh, there's 50 red flags. He's terrible. And you're like, no, 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 no. It's going to be fine, right? And 6 months later, you're like, why didn't I listen to those red flags? It's because we get emotional in those decisions. In the same way, I think that with business models, if it sounds really exciting and you like the person and you start creating this fantasy in your head of what they're like, of what the business will be like, but they can make their franchise sound amazing. And sometimes it's like, that's the part that they're good at, right? It's very different to run a hot dog restaurant than it is to sell franchises, right? And those are two different skill sets. Mm-hmm. So I want to dive just a little deeper into like, when you're looking at a franchise opportunity, or maybe someone comes to you and says, hey, you've got a lot of people, we have a new franchise, and what are some things that you go, oh, I'm running for the hills? Like you see that and you go, this is the wrong type of model, or the numbers aren't right, or there's just something about this type of company that isn't the right fit, or that I just would never invest in myself?
Yeah, those are all good questions. And I think one of the things that's really an important part of the process is when you can independently go search out your own franchises, right? I mean, it's very overwhelming. I talk to people every day that do that. Or you can work with somebody who has expertise and background that might help steer you away from some of those mistakes potentially. And, we are obviously, have a lot of knowledge in this space. And by working with an expert by your side, you're really able to kind of be prepared for those red flags, and they're out there. I mean, and I think if you have a call with a franchisor, or even the initial call that doesn't go well, you need to pay attention to it. If it's salesy, if they're pitching you something, they shouldn't be doing that. They should be taking their time. They need to actually follow a timeline, go through the steps, make sure you're educated on all their systems, which is a lot. So let's break those down. It's sales, it's marketing, and sales and marketing now falls into a digital platform. So what's the technology that they have to offer you? Followed by that is all their operation systems, accounting, finance. There's just so many facets to it. And you've got to kind of dive into those different pieces to find out, what do they actually have? What is the program? What's proprietary? What are the vendor relationships? How is this business going to work in my market? And franchise advising, one of the things I didn't know, Jonathan, was that, when I was working with somebody that I met in North Carolina in 2014, when we were hunting for a business, she tried to match me up with my transferable skills. So, Liz, what are you good at? What are you not good at? What is your risk tolerance? What do you want to get into? And the question she asked me is, which answers your question, are you willing to look at emerging brands? And my answer was no. So that was me. That was just me. Now, some people have a high risk tolerance. They're willing to do it. And so opportunities are out there, and everybody's looking for that next big thing. I wanted safety and security because we had operated and owned and sold, and I wanted something safe. I just wanted something safe with 0 employees. The franchise we purchased has been around since 1985. If that gives you any idea of, stability. And stability and track record, I think, are one of the two biggest things. And when you receive their, obviously disclosure documents, you can read between the lines. There's a lot of information in that lengthy document, which can be over 350 pages, which sounds overwhelming, but by law, they have to give that to you. But there's a lot of information you can uncover in there that will actually reveal some of the risk, if they've been in any litigation, if there's any red flags, how many franchises closed last year. So you can dig that up. You can really find it. But I think franchise advising, what we try to do is match people up with, they're looking for a consistent brand that's got a positive track record that has no holes in it. We'll listen to that. We will respond to that, and we'll find brands that fall in that line.
Yeah. A lot of people, when they're starting a business, whether it's an entrepreneurship, starting their own thing, or going the franchise route, they get excited by the wrong thing. Like they go, oh, this can make a lot of money, and they do something and then they hate it. I can't tell you how many of my friends, when the business succeeds, all they want to do is exit. And there are a lot of online business models that are so hard to exit, right? Like, how am I going to exit this business? I'm on every podcast episode, right? It takes about 2 years. If I wanted to exit this podcast, it's a 2-year process. I have to bring on a co-host and slowly be on less and less episodes. And that's something that's a big surprise if you want to exit your company. And that's sometimes people, they want the business that's the most money. So I like you're talking about matching what you're like and what you're good at, because managing employees, I know it's hard. People don't realize it's so hard running teams. And I'm always like going, okay, how can I run my business with no employees? I love you're talking about that, because I'm on the same wavelength, because I've had a team as large as 20, and it is really, really, really tough. Someone's always sick. Someone's always fighting with someone else. Someone's always shaving their minutes or messing with their time card. So there's so many things happening, and it's hard to watch everything. It's just very stressful. And it's like, oh, I go into a franchise and you don't know that. There's no warning. And I have to have all these employees. Or, yeah, like you talked about an emerging brand. It just sounds like it's easy to get excited by the potential, because there's no other ones in my town. Like my dream franchise is, like you mentioned, is like a storage unit or a 7-Eleven. Like that's the kind of thing I want, where basically it's been running forever. It's a really simple business model. It doesn't require a lot of workers, and you don't have to go and find your stuff. And also sometimes people, they want a lot of freedom. Like if you open up a McDonald's, you can't add your own items to the menu, right? You can't be like, oh, at my McDonald's, we also have hot dogs. Like they would never let you do that, right? And that's the trade-off. Some people really want to design the menu, and some people like, that's the last thing I want to do. So I think that the matching thing is really, really important. What are some like really common mistakes that people make when they join a franchise and they regret it and they're trying to get out, or they just lose everything? Like, how does that happen? I know for me, of course, I know one of them is getting emotionally involved or not looking at multiple ones and going to the first one you hear about. But like, what are some other things from your higher level of experience that, like, when people tell you horror stories, you can kind of look with hindsight, go, oh, this was the warning sign?
I tell everybody just to walk before you run. And I think growth is a wonderful word. And we admire the word growth, but I think you need to make sure you grow at a consistent pace. And you also need to have working capital to be able to grow at a consistent pace when you're starting out. And I would say, just all my years, even being a business owner, we've had, other friends, and we've known people, independent or franchising, that bit off more than they could chew, quite honestly. I mean, they wanted to be so big, so fast, hired too many people, ended up just doing too much. And it's a dream, but it's also a big risk. And I think start small. I give advice to many of the people that I'm coaching. The stars are there. The sky's a limit. But why don't you make sure that you can handle everything before you go in too deep? It's just not, it doesn't make sense, and it's going to cost you more money. And if you think about businesses expanding too quick, too fast, you need more employees. You need more of everything. So your costs are going to be doubled and tripled. And you just, you need to be prepared, and you need to analyze your numbers, and spreadsheets are great for that, to make sure that you are prepared for it and eyes wide open. And you might want what that other person has, but maybe they have more money than you. Maybe their skills and qualifications are different than what you have. So I think just word of caution to people is, low risk. There are so many investments out there right now, and you hit the nail on the head when we first started talking today. Everybody thinks of food, Subway. But now franchising has this other side to it that people forget about. This might be a good segue into this. Is there are brands called home service brands. And during COVID, these brands actually were strengthened. Brick and mortar, like food that you mentioned, got obviously hit pretty hard through COVID. We all know it. We don't even need to spend more time talking about it. They're recovering. Home-based service brands are anything to do with your home, and sometimes they service commercial businesses, but they're mobile. Their overhead is lower. Their margins are higher. The risk is lower. Investments lower. Those four things are attractive to a lot of, investors. Now, one of the differences with these service-based brands is that they usually want owner-operator. They want your time too. Not everybody's willing to give up their time, right? Maybe they have a self-storage business. Maybe they have, 2 or 3 businesses, and they think, oh, I'll just get a franchise. The service brands may not be a good fit for that person. But service brands, I want to bring up, for the audience today, that service brands are amazing, and it's not what you think in franchising, and you don't need to have $1 million. anything to do with your home, whether it's flooring, windows, security, landscaping, gutters, roofing, the list goes on. Those are service brands. And for many people that are in career transition with, corporate America, they look at these pretty closely. So anyway, that is another example of low risk and getting in. You're not buying yourself a job. You can actually be an owner operator. You can hire a team, but you can build out the executive model too.
Yeah, when my wife and I ran a hotel for a few years, the restaurant part was such a nightmare. People were always like, "Why don't you open a larger restaurant?" I hate the restaurant industry because it's so risky because you just have to think, well, how many chickens are people going to buy tonight? If you guess too low, you have angry customers who can't order. If you guess too high, you got to throw a chicken away tomorrow. It's so scary because it's like stock, except for the stock is constantly expiring, right? And it's like it's so stressful. I was like, and what do eggs cost today? What do eggs cost tomorrow? Your numbers are constantly changing. You can't change your prices on your menu every day. Like that stuff is totally like when people say, "Oh, so many businesses fail in the first 5 years." That's because 75% of those failures are restaurants. If you remove restaurants, businesses entrepreneurs have a much higher success rate. And it's like, that's why I like talk about this other stuff. We don't think about it, right? Like I always think about that movie Dumb and Dumber when he made the van look like a dog and he's like, "Oh, I do home dog care." It's silly, but it's also like a really good business model because you don't have to pay for a building. You don't have to pay for a fit out, right? Like that's the scary part. I have to build a building that looks like the franchise, then I have to do the design. That's going to get really expensive. And you haven't even
Mhm.
opened your doors yet. And then waiting for the customers to come to you means you have a small range. Like people won't drive, I think, more than 5 minutes to go to a martial arts studio. They'll never travel like 6 miles to go to a karate class. It's five or less. So, but if you're in a van and you're going to someone's house, I remember a guy who installed the bracket on the wall for my TV. This is like 10 years ago. And I was like, man, this guy's got a great business model, right? I think I paid him $300 for maybe 20 minutes of work, but he was the only guy in all of town doing it. He just had a van and a bunch of the brackets and a screwdriver. It's like a genius thing. So I think you're talking about some really good stuff because people, again, I think everyone wants glamorous. Everyone wants to be an influencer or a whatever star, and they don't realize that the business part is where things can be really cool. And that I like what you're talking about a lot because I think risk and risk management is probably the most important part of being a successful business is that when you go high risk, every once in a while you hit the moon, but those businesses don't last. And then you have all these problems because 99% of people go high risk lose. That's why casinos look so nice, right? They're
Mhm.
risky. If they weren't risky, they wouldn't have nearly as many lights and be able to afford as much nice stuff. So I think this is so important to talk about that. Like there are a lot of good stuff. I'm not a franchise guy, but I know it's the right fit for a lot of people. And that's why I like talking about this because I want to bring on people that understand things I don't understand and they're not my area of expertise. And I really like that it comes with a manual. Like there's so much benefit to that because starting from scratch, like I had to invent every process, everything, every project management, every spreadsheet. I had to invent that. And that's really hard. Like I think that people don't realize sometimes that the hardest part of business is employee management and systems. Like that's the hardest part to develop and that's the hardest part to maintain. So it's also exciting that you can actually have a no employee type franchise, that there are franchise models that aren't as labor intensive or supply intensive because there's, you know, once something works, why start over? Just take that thing that works and move it to the location. So I love it. What are your like looking forecasting right now? What are your favorite kind of niches or genres or franchises you think are really going to be solid for the next 10 years? Like you've talked about home services is like a really great one because it's low cost and you have a lot of control. And also when you want to grow, you just buy another van or whatever the
Yep.
mobile unit is, which is very cool. What else do you think is like a really good place for people that are thinking like what's going to be solid for 2020s and 2030s?
I mean, mental health is really coming into, position. We're seeing a lot of that. And then, the more humorous one, which I don't know if you love pets, but the pet industry obviously is growing rapidly. And again, there's brick and mortar options, but there's service brands too. And the pet industry, everybody got a dog during COVID. So the pet industry is one that is definitely out there. you've already mentioned the storage. A lot of high level investors are looking for those type of opportunities too for self storage. So that's really important. But I think those are kind of the three, and the service brands in general. Um, those are just really taking off. I mean, people weren't going to Home Depot and Lowe's during COVID, and they really became kind of accustomed to having people come to their house. Anything you need done, maintained, installed, repaired. Budget blinds, great example. You gave the example of the TV, and the whole time you were talking about the bracket, I'm thinking of, a budget blinds franchise. So simple, right? But everybody needs blinds. But I think those are kind of some of the big ones. And one other question you asked and you mentioned I wanted to touch on is exit strategy. Whenever you're getting into business ownership, and I don't know what your plan was with your hotel, but when you are investing in a business, you need to be thinking about what your plan is, right? What is the exit strategy? How am I going to be getting out of this business in the future? What if I had health issues? Would it be a family legacy business? So that's really important as part of your due diligence in interviewing other franchisees and the franchisor is, okay, I'm going to build this. I'm going to build cash flow because cash flow is king. And that's what investors look for in businesses. But many of these businesses can be sold after they're up and running, 5-7 years. So I wanted to also add in that the exit strategy should be a really important part of your decision. And you're going to find that out by asking owners that have been in it for, again, 10 years.
I'm glad you brought that up because so many independent businesses, I think 90% of people that try to sell their business, it never sells because everyone thinks their kids want to take over their business. And my kids definitely don't want to do what I do, right? I've got 4 of them. I'm like, let's just keep having them. Maybe one will want to do it. But there is this belief in family legacy. And we've created a society where that's less and less and less common, right? Everyone wants to do basically anything other than what their parents did. So it's important to, exactly like you said, know that if the kids want to take over, they can. And if the business needs to auto run with like a manager, it can, or that you can exit it, because there are a lot of businesses that are unexitable and you don't realize it because you don't have any assets. A friend of mine a few years ago was like, oh, we're going to sell our company for $1 million. I was like, no, you're not. And they went to this other company to make an offer like, hey, do you want to buy our company? The company's like, yeah, we don't want it. We're fine. And they got 0. And it was like, they were so excited because they created this number in their head. And I was like, what's your EBITDA? And he's like, what's that? I was like, uh-oh. Because I know like website brands buy, and depending on what your business model is, it's worth a multiple of your monthly revenue, right? Like that's how they are sold and stuff. And there's a lot of things people don't know. Like when you start a business, it's very stressful. And it's also, I'm glad you brought up mental health. There's a lot of issues of it's all on me, right? And I'm all alone and no one knows how I feel. And it's something we don't talk about very much. So I think it's good to talk about. And also I had 2 friends, they did an exit, a multi-million-dollar exit, and they were so depressed afterwards. And I was like, I didn't know you could get $1 million in your bank account and be depressed. And it was because they'd sold their baby and they had nothing to do anymore. And they were kind of like, we got to start a new business because we're bored. And there's these other parts of it that really matter. And going in, you have to think about, what do I really want? How much money do I need to maintain my lifestyle? How much money do I need to support my kids? And if you can do a lower risk business, right? Because that's the thing. If you get a loan for $250,000, you don't have to spend it all in the first 2 months of the business, right? Like it's not free money. You got to pay it back. And there's always going to be surprises, no matter what business model is. Something's going to break, something's going to go wrong. And you need that buffer because without it, you're in a tough spot. So I like a lot of what you're saying. I think that this is a really interesting thing for people to get interested in. I think there's a lot more opportunities coming. And also, if people have a good business model, they can also turn it into a franchise. And like, you don't just have to open other stores. There's another way to grow your business. And I think that there's just a lot of misperception about franchises because the only places you ever hear about them is either in movies like The Founder or when I'm watching The Profit. And it's like, it's always like, oh, this is scary franchise. I can't believe they're franchising it, or Shark Tank and stuff like that. And it's always food. It's always food. But there's a lot of opportunity out there, and it is like you talked about, risk profile. Franchises really lower the risk profile because at least someone's made it work before. It's starting from 0. You have a manual, you have a process, you have systems in place. And if you approach it methodically, you can find something that's a really good fit for you. And it's good to know it doesn't have to be crazy expensive. But I'd like to talk about that for just a second. Like how much money should you have to even consider franchising? Like what's the baseline number? Is it you need $25,000? Is you need 75? What's the number you go, okay, I should even consider franchising, or I just don't have enough money yet. I'm not in the game.
You know, I think that's a loaded question, but I'm going to answer it anyway. Franchise companies have a net worth requirement, and net worth was put in place for a good reason. So you can only borrow as much as your net worth, and many people aren't aware of that. It is what it is. So if a franchise company says I have a $500,000 net worth, they're going to make sure you have it. And part of my role as an advisor is we have everybody fill out a questionnaire, and we do see those numbers. It's nothing proprietary, right? They're all general numbers, but we need to see where they fall, because we want to look at investments that are actually in range. We don't ever want to look at investments that are outside of what they can afford. And obviously it's got to fit their lifestyle too. I wanted to mention that as well. Lifestyle is a really big driving force for people, along with motivation. And I feel that investment, if we look at service brands, the risk is so much lower because there's no building. And you've owned a building, I've owned a building. You and I both know that we probably had a very hefty payment to probably a third party lender. And those are typically SBA, Small Business Administration. Those are, with the interest rates right now, obviously, some people are, upset with interest rates right now, but they are what they are. Years ago, they were much higher. But if you're going to borrow money, you're going to pay to borrow money. Brick and mortar is going to be anything from, at least at a minimum, this is a minimum threshold, $275,000 and up. This could be, you think of fitness, food, wellness, hair care. I mean, the list goes on for brick and mortar, as you referenced in the beginning of this. And then on the service brand side, those can be anywhere from like 150,000 and under. And again, depending on their geographic market, how many zip codes they negotiate, because in franchising, you are investing in a territory that you will own the rights to. So it has borders, and it's usually 25 to 35-mile radius around where you live. But if you're one of these people, the visionary people that want to have a larger territory, you're going to pay more for it. So the price will be increased. So I hope that answers the question, but there's kind of two sides, two lanes, brick and mortar, and then the service brand. One is super high. One is obviously lower.
Yeah, I'm glad that is something you talked about, because I had a friend when I was living in Britain who was a plumber, and boy, what a job, right? You get to be your own boss. All you need is a van, and you can make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, because guess what? When someone's toilet's exploding, they'll pay whatever you say, right? Like you know what I mean? Like whatever it takes, just turn it off. So there's a lot of, unfortunately, I think in our society, we kind of look down on a lot of services, and it's like, there's actually not enough plumbers right now. There's not enough, a lot of these different services that you can do a lot with. So I'm glad we're bringing that up, because sometimes I think that we look down on these jobs, and I don't know why, right? There's a lot of things that I don't know how to do, and I'm glad people do. So I think that it's really good to talk about that, because it's a great opportunity. You get to be your own boss. It's really simple business model in the sense that you don't have to manage a bunch of employees unless you want to. You don't have to manage a location. Locations are so scary, because if you get anything wrong, it's a massive amount of money. And then you have to do the fit out, which is so scary. Like, oh, I'm renting this building, and then I got to pay another 75 grand to change it to whatever it has to look like. And then I hope it works, because it's going to take me 7 years to recover the cost of the fit out alone. And then if it's a bad location, or if something happens in that location that creates a problem, like if there's an issue with the parking lot, which you don't even think about, right? Like, oh, I'm in a strip mall, it's all good. No, because sometimes there's really specific rules about, like you mentioned, about territory, about how much of the lot you're allowed to use. Mm-hmm. I remember I've certainly gone to businesses where you're not allowed to park anywhere near the business because they're fighting their neighbors over parking lot spaces. And it's you didn't even think of that. So I'm always thinking about risk. And I know that franchise, it sounds like de-risking, but you can still make poor decisions that kind of put you in an awkward position, right? I always love when I see two Starbucks across the street from each other. What happened here? It's too close, right? Or there's a 7-Eleven on every corner. So exactly that. It's how much territory do I have? And is it enough for this business model, or are people going to be kind of going to the neighbor? So I love what you're talking about. This has been really helpful. It's been very interesting to me, and I love talking about things that are exciting to my audience. Where can people learn more about you, more about franchising, kind of see if this is the right business model for them?
Yeah. And I just want to follow up to talking about the plumber. I mean, you're talking about demand-driven services, Jonathan. That's what all of those are. And there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of demand-driven, services out there. And again, it's kind of the best kept secret in franchising, in my opinion. And I talk to people all over the country. So I think people just need to be aware that franchising is not just food. You don't need to have $1 million, and you can be one of these people to transition out of corporate America and transfer the skills. I actually did it. I was in corporate America for 22 years. So I have a website. The best way really to reach me, I think, would be my website. It's just Liz Leonard Franchise Advisor. I'm on LinkedIn as well. We offer free consultations. So, and this is another best kept secret. So as franchise coaches and advisors, we're kind of high level recruiters for the franchise companies. So we spend about, 6 to 8 weeks with all of our candidates. We do a 60-minute consultation with everybody. There's no charge. So again, nothing to lose and everything to gain by having a conversation. That's how business starts. But my website is the best way. I'd be happy to talk to anybody. And most of the people I meet have either grown up in an entrepreneurial family, grandpa had a business, and I've always thought about it. And the job has never seemed to suit me, Liz. And they just want to look at their options. And I can't help everybody, but I can help the people that have those high motivation and desires and the U factor to build a successful business.
Great. I love it. So guys, that's at yourfriendadvisor.com. And of course, it'll be in the show notes and below the video on YouTube. Thank you again so much for being here, Liz. It's been another amazing episode of the Serve No Master podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Artificial Intelligence Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss another episode. We'll be back next Monday with more tips and tactics on how to leverage AI to escape that rat race. Head over to artificialintelligencepod.com now to see past episodes, leave a review, and check out all of our socials.